If you want to get rid of highway robbery, you don't put a tax on highway robbery. If you want to get rid of speculation, which is ultimately the instrument of transferring wealth, you do not provide legitimacy to the speculator by taxing him 1% or whatever of his transactions. You freeze those transactions. And that is something which can be achieved. In other words, there are a whole series of speculative instruments on Wall Street which affect, let's say, the price of food, the price of oil, and which are impoverishing people worldwide. Now, how do you reverse the tide? You put a freeze on derivative trade. You don't tax the speculator. The speculators were the first people to endorse the Tobin tax. Why? Because they're stealing from the 99% by using very complex financial instruments. And if a tax is imposed, the legitimacy of their undertakings is not questioned. They pay the 1% tax that is used to compensate the people who have been expropriated and impoverished as a result of their actions, and it provides a human face to the speculative onslaught. That is what is behind this complicity of people like Warren Buffett, Ben Bernanke, in this Occupy Wall Street movement. You do not reverse the tide by taxing the rich. You have to tax the rich, but ultimately you have to address the broader question of how do these people enrich themselves at the expense of the 99%.
Interesting. So, one last question. Apparently, yesterday at the conference at the university there, apparently someone during the video about that was shedding light on what's actually happening in Libya, I heard that one of the people there cried and walked out. How important do you think it is to be able to gain the strength to face what is being done in our world, and often in our name?
Well, I think in Libya, atrocities have been committed by NATO. Thousands of people have been killed. The media is not reporting those atrocities. It has a responsibility as media, as journalists, to report the facts on the ground. But that is not happening. In fact, it's the reverse. They're obfuscating. They are acting as a camouflage, as a cover-up, and they are providing a human face to the rebels, which in large part are made up of Al-Qaeda militia. This is not a pro-democracy movement, and what has happened is that the media has supported this war. Without the media, they could not have run this war, because they would not have been able to camouflage the impacts of those bombings. But anybody who has a minimal understanding of fighter aircraft knows that if you have 10,000 strike sorties with a dozen missiles on each of these fighter planes, you're going to kill a lot of people. You're talking about 50,000, above 50,000 bombs, and it's certainly worth noting that already in the month of April, after 1 month of bombing, NATO has said, we're running out of bombs. They're running out of bombs. That's an incredible observation against a country of 6 million people. And then they would make the same statement, we haven't killed anybody. So people don't analyze necessarily that data, which comes out from NATO. Every week they will publish the number of strike sorties. But the military analysts working for the mainstream media, who know the planes, who have an understanding of war and of the impacts of advanced weapon systems, they have a responsibility to report those, to analyze them. They're not. And yes, atrocities are being committed. But what I find disturbs me is that when you go to Occupy Wall Street, they say we must implement pro-democracy following the example of our brothers in Libya, our brothers and sisters in Libya. And they're referring to the Transitional Council, which is made up of a bunch of criminals, okay, and which does not represent the Libyan population. And so that, and then they present Gaddafi as the, you know, as the enemy of democracy. Gaddafi, I'm not particularly a fan of Gaddafi, but Gaddafi is not the enemy of democracy. It's the United States of America, which in the course of the last 100 years has supported dictatorships all over the world. And now they're saying we're pro-democracy. The fact is, if they don't like a particular head of state or head of government, it's the case of Gaddafi, they go in and they kill him. And they kill members of his family and his grandchildren. And that is not the way you implement democracy. You implement democracy by respecting the sovereignty of countries and the rights of people in those countries to decide on how they want to run their own affairs. And I think it's important for the record that Libya was one of very few countries in the world which did not obey the diktats of Washington and of the International Monetary Fund. And as a consequence of that, whether we like Gaddafi or not, the figures published by the United Nations, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, confirm that the standard of living in Libya is the highest in Africa. There's full employment, there's almost 100% literacy, there's 50% of students who graduate from high school go to university, and it is by African standards an advanced welfare state. Whether we like the political regime or not, we have to acknowledge that. And what has happened with the bombings over a period of several months since March is the destruction of a country, of its water system, of its food supplies, of its schools, its hospitals, its universities, because these have been bombed, and we have evidence that they're bombed. And if the Occupy Wall Street movement is a significant movement, pro-democracy movement in the United States of America, Canada, and the Western world, it should take a stance against those NATO bombings. It should not present NATO as the role model, or the rebels as the role model, and that is precisely what was implied in some of those statements made in Wall Street, that ultimately we should support our brothers and sisters in Libya who are fighting against Gaddafi. Those brothers and sisters are essentially Al-Qaeda. They don't represent the majority of the population, which ironically was supportive of the government. I mean, there's opposition within all of those societies, but broadly speaking, that society, that country had a project, it had a high standard of living, it had an educated population, and the result of this 7 months of bombing has been to destroy a country. And it's certainly not a role model for Occupy Wall Street. And so Occupy Wall Street has to take a stance, not only against Wall Street, but against all the wars which are led by Wall Street, by the oil companies, by Washington, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Palestine, in Libya, but in other parts of the world where they come in the Congo, in Rwanda, in Somalia, which is characterized by an agenda. It's the agenda of going after terrorists, going after Al-Qaeda. But then we discover that Al-Qaeda is a creation of the CIA, and that Al-Qaeda, in effect, are the foot soldiers of NATO in Libya. It's the Libya Islamic Fighting Group, which constitutes the main paramilitary force. And then we discover that in Syria, the gunmen involved in the confrontation with the government forces are paid mercenaries, which are Salafists, Al-Qaeda affiliated, and they're also supported by Western intelligence. And this is an insurgency which purports to destabilize a sovereign country, whether we like al-Assad or not. I'm not particularly a fan of al-Assad either. I think it's an authoritarian regime, but I respect the right of the Syrian people to decide on their own future without the intrusion of armed gunmen paid by foreign powers. And that is what is happening. And when the media also has a responsibility of reporting what's going on in Syria, and when they have protesters armed with heavy machine guns, they have the responsibility to acknowledge that, because that's not a protest movement, that's an insurgency.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us and donating your time, Professor Michel Chossudovsky. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Delighted.